In this video, we'll look at cards that were placed on the ban list in some way, shape, or form, and go over why some of these cards, which look particularly unimpressive at first glance, were placed on the ban list. And at number 10, we have Apprentice Magician. This card has the effect that when it's summoned, you can place a spell counter on a card that can have spell counters on it. And if this card is destroyed by battle, you can special summon a level 2 or lower spellcaster monster from your deck in face-down defense position. Now, in the current meta of Yu-Gi-Oh!, this card would not be useful at all because it's too slow, and has a battle destruction floating effect. But in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, cards which can replace themselves after being destroyed by battle were pretty decent, and actually saw play here or there. And this particular card was semi-limited for about 2 years, from March 2006 to March 2008. So why was this card semi-limited for 2 years? Well, for two reasons. First off, Breaker the Magical Warrior was one of the most played staple cards in the game, and in fact was limited on the ban list during this time period, and was even forbidden for one format during the time Apprentice Magician was semi-limited. And what Breaker does is it can remove a spell counter from itself to destroy a spell or trap card on the field. Normally, this card only gains one spell counter when it's normal summoned, so Apprentice Magician allowed you to refill it with spell counters to destroy more spell and trap cards. And since Apprentice Magician could summon other copies of itself, you could potentially refill the spell counters on Breaker multiple times. That's not all. Apprentice Magician also had 3 really good targets from the deck, besides other copies of itself. During the time period Apprentice Magician was semi-limited, Magician of Faith was also not banned yet, and Magician of Faith eventually got banned in December 2007, and stayed banned for a really long time before coming off the list. Because what it would do is allow you to recycle any spell card from your graveyard, and it can be searched directly from your deck after refueling a spell counter, which was pretty good. Apprentice Magician also allowed you to search out Old Vindictive Magician, who could destroy a monster when it's flipped face up, and could search out Hand of Nephthys, which would allow you to special summon a Sacred Phoenix directly from your hand or deck. And in this time period, decks were slow enough where you could realistically use both of Apprentice Magician's effects. So it was actually pretty good in this format, and saw play in competitive decks. And then it came off the ban list once they banned Breaker the Magical Warrior for the second time, and then they also banned Magician of Faith. So with those two cards banned, they didn't really need Apprentice Magician semi-limited anymore, so they put it to unlimited, and then left it there even after Breaker came off the ban list again. And then the speed of the game got to the point where it was no longer good. This one has a couple of good reasons as to why it was on the ban list, although you wouldn't have known that if you hadn't played during those formats, as this card sees absolutely no competitive play in today's Yu-Gi-Oh! And that would be kind of the name of the game for like the first half of this list. Some of these cards were pretty decent during the time they came out, and that's why they were put on the ban list in some way, shape, or form, but are pretty laughable when compared to today's metagame. And at number 9, we have Protector of the Sanctuary, who was limited to 1 copy per deck for like 3 years in the time period of 2004 to 2007. Now, what this card does is, while this card is out in the field, your opponent cannot draw cards except during their draw phase. So, on surface level, the way to use this card would be to stop your opponent from using things like Pot of Greed, or cards that let them draw outside of their draw phase. Of course, this card was rarely used for its intended purpose, and was almost always used in order to get rid of your opponent's hand. Because you see, there are certain cards in the game, like Disturbance Strategy, which force your opponent to shuffle their hand back into their deck and then draw the same number of cards. But if you had something like Protector of the Sanctuary out in the field, then they would just shuffle their hand back into their deck and draw nothing, and then they would just lose their entire hand to a 2-card combo, which is really good. That's why this card has a whole bunch of extra rulings in place, things you just have to know, where you basically cannot use the effects like Disturbance Strategy if Protector of the Shrine is on the field already. So you have to kind of cheat those extra rulings by chaining something like Call of the Haunted to Disturbance Strategy, so that you can get Protector of the Sanctuary out in the field as the chain resolves backwards. And then your opponent will lose their entire hand to a 3-card combo, except one that requires a little setup in the graveyard first. And since there were workarounds to its special ruling, this card was limited so you wouldn't be able to get rid of your opponent's entire hand so easily. Especially when the meta in the early portions of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was to get rid of cards from your opponent's hand. But then eventually this strategy became outdated and was nothing more than a gimmick, so it got released from the ban list because it didn't really need to be limited anymore, nor did it really need to be limited in the first place. And at number 8, we have Marauding Captain. This card was semi-limited for 3 years, from 2002 to 2005. And what this card does is, when it's normal summoned, you can special summon a level 4 or lower monster from your hand. So it's really good at swarming the field from your hand, as it can target any level 4 or lower monster in your hand, especially in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! When special summoning was pretty difficult to do. And few monster cards had effects to special summon. However, it was most likely put on the ban list for its first effect, where your opponent cannot target your warrior monsters for attacks except this one. So if you had 2 copies of Marauding Captain out, and you only played warrior type monsters, your opponent could not attack you, as the 2 captains would loop to each other in a way that made it so you were basically immune to attacks. And since Marauding Captain could special summon another Marauding Captain from your hand, this loop could be accomplished as long as you just had 2 copies of the card in your hand, which was incredibly easy to pull off. So it was limited to 2 copies to make it less likely to pull off the unattackable combo, until they eventually figured out it wasn't a big deal anymore and just released it from the ban list. As without being able to destroy these cards by battle, the only way to break the effect loop was to destroy them by card effects, and there were lots of strong spell or trap cards back then that could destroy monsters, so it wasn't the hardest thing to break against the average meta deck. But it was still something they didn't like very much, so they tried to restrict it with a semi-limit. And at number 7, we have Backup Soldier. This is a trap card that can only be activated if you have 5 or more monsters in your graveyard, which will then allow you to target up to 3 of your non-effect monsters with less than 1500 attack in your graveyard, and then add them to your hand. So with full setup, this card is a +2 in card advantage, which is pretty good. And that's why this card was limited and semi-limited on the ban list for 2 years, in the very early parts of Yu-Gi-Oh! In like January 2001. Now, the reason this card was taken off the ban list is because back then, there wasn't really a good use for vanilla monsters with less than 1500 attack. So even if you could go +2 off of this effect, it required a lot of setup, and it didn't really give you useful cards. The best use of those monsters was probably just to use them as discard fodder with other things like Graceful Charity, which was still legal at this time. So I'm pretty sure this card was only on the ban list because it was a +2 on paper, which sounds good, and then it was eventually removed because those cards weren't very useful, especially in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Before you could use low attack vanilla monsters as combo pieces. And at number 6, we have Yellow Gadget, which was semi-limited in the September 2007 format only, and then was put back to unlimited in the very next format, and was never placed on the ban list ever again. And this card was semi-limited alongside the other 2 gadgets, and what the gadgets are is basically if one of them is summoned, they can search out one of the other 2 from the deck, except each one searches out a specific gadget. So if you play 3 copies of all 3 gadgets, you'll be able to search out all of them with only 1 gadget, eventually. So the gadgets were always pretty decent, as each one was a +1 when they were summoned, and they allowed you to consistently add monsters to your hand while swarming the field. But there was never really a good way to use them before Synchros came out in 2008, Machina Fortress came out in 2009, or until Exceeds monsters came out in 2011. And you may notice all of the best uses of gadgets weren't until after they were semi-limited, and then put back to unlimited. So why were they randomly semi-limited for this one format in 2007 before any of their good support came out? I don't actually know the real answer to this question, other than the fact that gadgets were always just kind of decent, especially if used with Ultimate Offering, and they were just released in English that year. But also, during the same ban lists, they moved Pot of Avarice from limited to semi-limited, and then they also added the Transmigration Prophecy to the ban list for the first time, putting it at limited where it stayed for a really long time. And both of these cards directly help gadgets, as being able to recycle them back into the deck means the gadgets can keep adding cards to their hand longer. So I'd assume they semi-limited the gadgets because they didn't want to make Pot of Avarice too strong, and then immediately figured out that wasn't really a problem, so they just removed them from the ban list in the next format. And even when Exceeds monsters came out, and the gadgets were actually super good when combined with Ultimate Offering, they didn't put gadgets on the ban list again, and instead just banned Ultimate Offering. So it was kind of odd that they appeared on the ban list in the first place. And at number 5, we have Gravekeeper Servant. This is a continuous spell card which has the effect where your opponent must send the top card of their deck to the graveyard in order to declare an attack. And this card was semi-limited on the ban list for about 3 formats in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! from July 2000 until January 2001. And Gravekeeper's Servant has a really good combo with cards like Macrocosmos that banishes all cards instead of sending them to the graveyard, where if you have these two cards out on the field at the same time, your opponent cannot declare an attack, since they can't technically send the top card of their deck to the graveyard. But these combos didn't exist this early on in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. So the reason this card was actually put on the ban list was because they thought effortless mill cards were good back then, so they just kind of hit a lot of cards randomly that could mill, and then eventually decided they weren't a big deal and just removed them from the ban list. And even when Macrocosmos did come out, they did not put Gravekeeper's Servant back on the ban list. And at number 4, we have Drop Off. This card has an effect where, when your opponent draws a card for the draw phase, your opponent discards one card they just drew. And this card was semi-limited for one format starting in 2006, before it went back to unlimited in the very next format. Now, this effect is okay. It's basically just a one-for-one trade, and it denies your opponent their draw phase essentially. But it's kind of limited in its uses, as it can only be played during your opponent's draw phase. You have to wait for your opponent's turn in order to get rid of that card, and that's only useful if you're trying to deny your opponent's hand from having cards in it in general. Otherwise, you could play any other combo extender or generic staple over Drop Off. And that's why this card was a staple in hand control decks, which were part of the first meta decks in the earliest formats of Yu-Gi-Oh!, as this card was played alongside Delinquent Duo, Confiscation, and the Forceful Sentry. So when these three cards eventually got banned, it would make sense that Drop Off just kind of got hit by association. But that's not really the case, because you see, the Forceful Sentry was banned a year earlier in March 2005. Delinquent Duo got banned 2 years earlier in 2004, before it came off the ban list for a little bit and then went back on the ban list in September 2005. And Confiscation was still limited to one copy at the time Drop Off was put to semi-limited. So, none of these dates really add up. It doesn't really make any sense why they semi-limited Drop Off, and it wasn't really doing anything, since the days of the hand control decks were long over by the time it got hit. But during the March 2006 ban list, the one which put Drop Off to 2 copies, they also banned 8 other iconic banned cards. So it was a huge ban list for getting rid of overpowered cards in the game. So I think they just kind of went a little ban happy and hit Drop Off since, well, it used to be played in good decks, and then figured out it wasn't actually that good. So they released it from the ban list in the next format, where it has never appeared on the ban list again since. And at number 3, we have Emergency Provisions, which I think is the only pure life point gain card to ever appear on the ban list, outside of the world's special ban list. And this card was semi-limited for a full year, from March 2005 to March 2006. And what this card does is it allows you to send as many of your other spell and trap cards on the field to the graveyard in order to increase your life points by 1,000 per card sent. Now, normally, pure life point gain cards are not very good, unless you have a way of using life point gains to your advantage. And the reason people were using Emergency Provisions was because it was a quick play spell card that could send your other spell and traps to the graveyard. The fact that it gave life points was kind of an added bonus, but I'm sure the people who used Emergency Provisions kind of wished it did something better, because during the same time period this card was semi-limited, they also put Good Goblin Housekeeping on the semi-limited list. Good Goblin Housekeeping allows you to draw a card +1 equal to the number of Good Goblin Housekeepings you have in your graveyard. Then you get to select one card from your hand and return it to the bottom of your deck. So if you use this card with no copies in your graveyard, you go -1 off of its effect, and that -1 continues to increase until eventually it turns into a +1, if you have 2 copies of the card in your graveyard. So if you combo this card with Emergency Provisions, you could activate Emergency Provisions in response to Good Goblin Housekeeping, or multiple copies of it, which would then resolve backwards, sending the Good Goblin Housekeepings to the graveyard before their effects activate. And then their effects will still activate on the field, counting the copies of themselves in the graveyard for their own effects. So that would allow you to draw an additional card for each Good Goblin Housekeeping, and could turn its potential +1 into a potential +2, which could be transferred over to all the other copies if you played multiple at the same time. Now, this surprisingly isn't a super good combo, But Konami was limiting a lot of their draw cards in this time period, so they hit all potential combos no matter how consistent they were. And when Emergency Provisions came off the ban list, they didn't take Good Goblin Housekeeping off the ban list too until a year later, in March 2007, even though it wasn't really seen competitive play very much. And at number 2, we have Injection Fairy Lily. This card was limited in 2002, where it stayed until it was banned for one format in 2004, and then it was then put back to limited in September 2004, where it stayed until March 2007, when it was taken off the ban list completely. And what this card does is, if this card battles a monster, you can pay 2,000 life points to increase the attack of this card by 3,000, during the damage calculation only. So at 400 base attack, this card could beat over any monster with less than 3,300 attack, which was basically all the monsters in the game at that point. And since this was a level 3 monster that could beat over big beat sticks like Summon Skull, just by paying tons of life points, regardless if it was attacked or attacking, made it pretty good in those days of beatdown decks. Because you could also use this effect if you were just attacking directly, for a large chunk of life point damage. However, this card wasn't that good, and definitely not ban-worthy, as it's one of the 3 cards in the game's history that was only banned for one format. I think this card was only really banned because they didn't want a small, easy-to-summon level 3 monster to be able to beat over boss monsters that required resources in order to bring out, regardless if it was meta-defining or not, which is why it was an odd card to be placed on the ban list. Even if it was technically good, it never saw the amount of competitive play that would warrant its limitations. This card on the ban list seems more like an over-precaution rather than being put on there for being abused in the game. And since they were so afraid of this card potentially being good that it got banned, I think this card could easily take a top spot on this list, but not the number 1 spot. And at number 1, we have Dark Scorpion, Chick the Yellow, who was semi-limited for one format in March 2005. Now, normally, the Dark Scorpions are kind of a joke archetype for being bad, as the only good Dark Scorpion card that saw lots of competitive play was Don Zalug, who didn't even have Dark Scorpion in his name. And yet, randomly, Chick the Yellow showed up on the ban list for one format before going back to Unlimited. So why was this card placed on the ban list? Well, because of its interactions with another banned card called Makura the Destructor. You see, Makura has an effect that when it's sent to the graveyard, you can activate trap cards from your hand for the rest of the turn. So if you use Call the Haunted from your hand in order to bring back Chick the Yellow, and if Chick the Yellow inflicted battle damage to your opponent, he can activate its first effect that allows you to target any one card on the field and return it to the hand. So if you then just targeted your own Call the Haunted and returned it to your hand, Chick the Yellow would get destroyed due to Call the Haunted's effect, and then you'd have the Call the Haunted back in your hand. And here's the thing about trap cards, all of them are spell speed 2 or higher, including the continuous trap cards like Call the Haunted. As being spell speed 2, you can activate Call the Haunted during the battle phase, if you have the availability of activating trap cards from your hand, with Makura's effect. So you could then just activate Call the Haunted from your hand during that same battle phase, bring back Chick the Yellow, who could then attack again and activate its effect to return Call the Haunted back to your hand. And then it would go back to the graveyard, and then you could just repeat this combo for an infinite amount of life point damage. So it seems pretty reasonable that they put Chick the Yellow on the ban list, since Call the Haunted was already a very heavily played staple in this era, and all they had to do was just play Makura and Chick the Yellow in order to potentially give them an unlimited amount of attacks during the battle phase, assuming they could attack directly, of course. However, here's the interesting thing about the March 2005 format. This is the exact same ban list which banned Makura the Destructor. So the whole reason Chick the Yellow was placed on the semi-limited list was because of its interactions with Makura, which they had also banned in this exact same ban list, which means there was no way to even use its combo. It would have made sense for them to semi-limit this card if Makura was still a live card in the game, but it wasn't. So technically, there was no reason to put this card on the ban list at all, since it wasn't useful outside of that combo, which is why this card was immediately taken off the ban list in the very next format, and why it has never since been put back on the ban list, since Makura the Destructor is one of the most broken cards in the game and will never come off the ban list. So while a lot of the other cards on this list kind of had reasons why they were put on the ban list, even if most of them seem to be an overreaction, Chick the Yellow is the only one that did not really need to be put on the ban list at all, while also being a kind of obscure card that was never very good anyway on its own, which is why I think it should take the #1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the end of the video. If you think I missed any better cards that were placed on the ban list for a weird reason, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And did you know 67.5% of the people who watch my videos are not subscribed to the channel? So if you like the videos and wish to see more just like this one, make sure to subscribe to be notified of future videos.